bag on the handlebar of my bicycle because I had a few things in it that you could buy without coupons, and it was not a good idea if you had something to hide to travel in France with a basket or a suitcase, because that would be the first thing they'd open to see what was in it. And I cycled night and day. I got through the German lines. When I got to this town further north, Châteauroux, there was a big barricade of the Germans. So I waved to the German officer on the other side of the road and said to him in French, "Do you want to search me?" And he looked at me, and I was younger than I am now, and he probably thought I was innocent looking with a little string bag, and he said, "No, mademoiselle, carry on." So I got through the things.
After 5 hours cycling Châteauroux, she made contact with London via Algiers. A new radio and codebook were sent on the next parachute drop.
But by that time I was getting very tired, and I did something I shouldn't have done. I took the main road back to our headquarters, and you know that I had travelled over 500 kilometres, and I got back in just 71.5 hours. My thighs were raw. I couldn't talk. All I could do, I couldn't sit down, I couldn't lie down, I couldn't stand up, I couldn't eat, I couldn't drink. All I could do, when anybody asked me how I was, I'd cry.
For men in this war, it meant fighting. For some women, survival meant other things.
A group of unruly men in our marquee, mind you, you couldn't know what they were all doing all the time, and they had taken 3 girls, 2 French girls and this German girl, and they had them hidden in their camp. So I went to the people and I said, "You're going to release those girls." They'd been used as prostitutes. The 2 French girls were no problem, but the German was a different thing. She was a spy sent in to spy on us and to report back to the Gestapo. She was the enemy. The French were very gallant, and I said, "You've got to shoot her." They said, "Oh, we can't possibly shoot a woman." So I said, "Well, if you're not going to shoot her, I'll shoot her." I was never violent by nature. I was a very soft person. But war is war. And people who might think that I was a bit ruthless to do this must remember that if I had kept that German and she had escaped and she'd gone back and bought the Germans, a lot of wives and mothers and daughters would have said, "Why did Andre let this happen? Why did she let our menfolk be killed?" So she had to be eliminated. I remember seeing some of the dreadful things that the Germans did. And when people today say that the Germans were not as guilty as they made out to be, this is a lie. Some Germans were ruthless. I can remember a German officer ordering his corporal to bayonet a French woman who was tied to a post in this village, who was 7 months pregnant, and he crisscrossed her stomach, and her little 2-year-old daughter was crying by her side. They wouldn't let the villagers bury this woman. She was left there for 24 hours. The flies, can you imagine it? I saw that. They were animals. I remember what they did to the Jews in Berlin and in Vienna. And I'm not Jewish, so it wouldn't worry me, would it? But they were human beings. I just couldn't imagine that human beings could behave like that.
Many weeks after the Normandy beachhead had been secured, the rapidly growing Allied armies began to break out into the French interior and pushed on towards Paris. In central France, the Marquis de Verne, now in control of forests and countryside, began to take the fight into the cities.
I think the most exciting thing I did was with Henri Tardivard in Montluçon, because that was his area. He was born in the department of the Allier, and he didn't care what he did as long as it was for France. Henri Tardivard was devoted to his country. He was a very clever man, very brainy, great sport, loved his rugby, football, loved all the good things of life. I must admit that he was probably my favourite Frenchman. The German barracks aren't here anymore. They've obviously been taken away, but they were just behind me there. And Henri Tardivard sent me a message to say that when I'd finished sending my messages to London, if I'd like a bit of fun, to join him in the fight against the Germans. He said, well, we've decided we might go and attack one of the Gestapo stations. And he said they always drink a lot before lunch, so we'll go just about 12:05 when they've had about 6 drinks. And it was a little house, and there were about 30 rooms in it. And we went up in cars, and were each given a grenade. I got out of the car and I raced up the back stairs, opened the door and threw in a grenade and ran like the devil. And everybody did the same thing. So an awful lot of Germans didn't have any more drink that day or any lunch. I mean, they were just buried. But the funny thing was, it wasn't terribly funny at the time, was that people in Montluçon were so impressed by this exercise, they thought the liberation had come. And we were saying, for God's sake, go back into your houses. This is not the liberation. This is just a little exercise.
In the first few days of August, the German garrison started to leave Paris. The next day, the police force went on strike. This was the spark which began the liberation of the city by its own citizens. Five days later, on August the 15th, the long-awaited invasion of the South became a reality. 300,000 Allied troops disembarked between Toulon and Cannes. Germany's fate was now sealed. Under relentless attack from both west and south, the Germans were forced out of France and were withdrawing their troops back to the Rhine, leaving behind 4 years of deep scars from the occupation.
After living in the forests for so long, and now with the Germans presenting no great threat to the Marquis, we were determined to find more comfortable quarters. And 10 kilometres from Montluçon, we found ourselves installed in a marvellous chateau, the Chateau de Fresnes. Paris had been liberated on the 25th of August, and we could see that the end of the war was coming, and the Germans were getting out pretty fast. I don't suppose you can, that anybody, unless they've gone through this themselves, can imagine the relief it was, the happiness that one felt after so many years, whether you were a foreigner as I was or a local person. I mean, you'd been under the boot of the Germans or the Milice for all that time, and the French, of course, could see that the end of the war was coming, that victory was near, and they were coming out and they were able to be friendly with us. And you think to yourself, oh my goodness, it's been worthwhile. We've gone through hell to get here.
For Nancy, the Marquis de Verne and her S.O.E. colleagues, the war was over. But the celebrations were clouded by tragedy.
This awful news was announced to me in Vichy that day that we were at the cenotaph. It was quite a shock that when this woman came over to me, she saw me with this official party, and she said, "What are you doing now?" I'd known her. She worked in a hotel where I used to live, where we had our wedding reception in Marseille. She came over to me and she said, "Where are you going now?" And I said, "I'm going down to Marseille." She said, "What are you going to do there?" I said, "I'm going to see Henri." Oh, she said, "But he's dead." Well, lovely way to announce the news, wasn't it? Well, of course, I broke down.
Henri Fiocca had been arrested by the Gestapo in May 1943. Under torture, he refused to disclose the whereabouts of his beloved White Mouse. He was executed 5 months later. The depleted and demoralized German army, fighting desperately to save Hitler's Reich, fought on for a further 9 months, until May 1945. The war for Europe was over.